Hello, Rob. How are you?
Very good, Rich. And yourself?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm still basking in the afterglow. I'm not a Crystal Palace fan, but my wife's dad was a Palace season ticket holder. He was at the cup final in 1990. There would have been plenty of Palace fans that were at that cup final in 2016, traipsing into Wembley, probably in partly in trepidation, but also in anticipation. And I don't know about you, Rob, but I haven't seen an outpouring like that at a final whistle of a football match. And I think, we talk a lot, don't we? And we'll be talking about it this weekend about qualification for the Champions League. But, for me, qualification for the Champions League lasts a season, whereas, winning a trophy will last most of those supporters a lifetime.
Do you know, when you were talking about outpouring of emotion then, I thought you were going to tell us about your epic 100-mile ride at the weekend, not the Palace Manchester City final.
There was quite an outpouring of emotion when I finished.
You're dead right, though. We talk so much, don't we, about the importance of European or Champions League qualification. We talk about the fact that getting into the Champions League earns clubs 100 million euros, or the Europa League at 60 million euros. We very often forget, though, that the reason why a lot of these clubs actually compete on the field of play is not necessarily for those big paychecks for the Champions League. It's actually to have their name etched onto the trophy, because no one really remembers who finished second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth or seventh in a league. No one remembers when clubs exit those European competitions, but people really remember when their club, the team they've supported since they were a small child, is able to go to a stadium like Wembley and turn over a relative giant in Manchester City. And I was well impressed with the game, B, some of the talking points to do with the game, but C, the kind of the visceral material impact it clearly had on all those fans at Wembley, and of course the local community as well.
Yeah, and I saw some nice bits on BBC London last night with teachers draped in Palace scarves and they were interviewing 8, 9, 10, 11-year olds at primary schools in Croydon, and they were clearly absolutely just bowled over by Palace winning the FA Cup. And you got the sense that was going to breed an entirely new generation of Crystal Palace fans who might otherwise not have ever dreamt of setting foot in Selhurst Park before. And I guess that's the power, isn't it, of winning a trophy. And we would have seen that with West Ham winning the Conference League. We saw how much that meant, and we saw it at in Newcastle in the Carabao Cup as well. And maybe we've become too obsessed in this country about European qualification. We've lost sight of what's actually important, because for a long time clubs weren't even putting their first teams out in the FA Cup. It was like a reserve team tournament, wasn't it?
Yeah, lost sight of, or we've had it kind of rammed down our throats about the era of the behemoth football club, the multi-club group, the club that has the wealthiest benefactor that's starting to buy trophies and make their club into a trophy asset or a sport washing ingredient. The reality is, though, the whole European football ecosystem is littered with clubs with history, with passion, with community impact and roots. And a victory like Palace experienced in an FA Cup final brings people together. It's hugely celebratory, and as you just said, kind of local news reporting that teachers perhaps going into schools with the Palace shirts on, young kids wanting the Palace shirt on with Eze's name on it, or Adam Wharton or Mark Gay or anybody like that. That really does generate that kind of early formative years of football fandom, and for Palace generates them fans of the future, but for the European football landscape puts Crystal Palace back on the map as a club that can compete, and it's not going to have to necessarily worry about some of these clubs that earn 6, 7, 800 million pounds a year and dwarfs Palace in terms of size. So, great for Palace as a club, great for the players, the manager, but hugely impressive and important for the community as well.
And it's worth remembering, isn't it, that the likes of Manchester United, the likes of Arsenal, Liverpool, didn't become popular clubs because had loads of money, or because they did things in a certain way. They became popular clubs. It's easy, I guess, to become a popular club in your local community if you're the only club in that local community. But if you're going to spread that popularity and generate commercial and sponsorship revenues elsewhere, then the only way, the best way of doing that is by winning trophies, isn't it? It's why people in Scandinavia got massive Liverpool following, people following Forest because of what Brian Clough did with the club, and Man City. They've grown exponentially worldwide, not because they've got rich owners, but because they won the Premier League and the Champions League.
Yeah, I'd probably argue that's interlinked. The fact they've got rich owners has allowed them to generate that sporting success. But you're also right that the winning of those trophies, Champions League, Premier League, FA Cup, Carabao Cup, is hugely important on that kind of ongoing sustained basis, so that you can begin to extend your global footprint. We often talk about the importance of traditional fans, and then we talk about the importance of the local market in which the club operates. But some of those big super clubs now, by virtue of their playing success, their local market is now all four corners of the globe. So, you'll go over to Abu Dhabi or the Middle East, and you will see people getting onto planes with Manchester City shirts coming over. Although I think it took them quite a while to sell out their full allocation at the weekend. That might be perhaps because their fans are too used to going to Wembley, God forbid. Also might signify that their fan base actually is a little bit smaller than perhaps some of those other super clubs. For a club like Palace, though, it's an opportunity for them to really break into that group of kind of top 8, top 10 clubs. They'll benefit from those additional revenues, and the additional revenues that they generate, the additional sponsorships, commercial activations they're able to deliver next season, and whilst they're playing in Europe, of course, will then increase their chance of being able to deliver silverware again. And the more silverware you can deliver, ultimately, that's how you build dynasties of football clubs and historic legacies. And you were right to point out the likes of Manchester United, Liverpool to an extent, Arsenal, even Chelsea in the Abramovich era kind of were able to jettison themselves into a new wave of football fandom, which now means they're supported in a much more kind of globalised area.
I guess the special thing about that FA Cup final, which I think, to be fair, I think that's going to be an FA Cup final, and so many of them, I think, if you've got two big clubs playing each other at Wembley and two clubs where groups of fans are used to going to Wembley, kind of all blend into one, don't they? That Chelsea v Man City, or Liverpool v Arsenal. What I think, you had such a massive concentration of Palace fans at Wembley that in the end, even I was welling up. Hard-nosed me was cheering for every minute that they added on for injury time. I think it was about
unbelievable.
10 or 11 in the
10
end.
minutes or something at the end.
Yeah, it was never ending. But then at the final whistle, and you could just see how much that meant to those people, and the ground was still full. At the Palace end, half an hour after, no one left, and it was just brilliant. I think it was just a great. Man City fans obviously won't agree, or maybe they would, because they've been there when they haven't been favourites as well, and they know what that means for a club. And I suppose from a Palace perspective, it now makes it easier, probably not massively easier, but easier to an extent for them to keep their prized assets with the prospect of the Europa League next season. Yeah,
look, I think helps that Wembley is in Greater London, so the kind of ability for those fans to get over there was a lot easier, and I dare say that all around Wembley was just awash with Crystal Palace fans, because they are a hugely passionate following and a hugely historic football club. There is something about the underdog story in that as well, isn't there? So I think a lot of the neutrals on Saturday would have been back in Palace because they were coming up against the mighty Manchester City. But from the parts of the game I watched, and I didn't see all of it because I was stuck in a sports hall watching netball, a lot of the parts of the game that I watched, Palace were really excited. They didn't try and shut the game down like you might expect a so-called smaller club to do. It wasn't a boring final. They really went at City, and there were a couple of refereeing decisions that perhaps went in Palace's favour, albeit the penalty I thought was pretty soft in itself. But they were exciting. They battled hard. They played a brand of football that I think they were, they've been trained clearly to play that brand of football. But it was refreshing to see a team go at a team like Manchester City, thinking that they had a level of vulnerability about them, and actually turn the game into a real spectacle. And that's great for a fan, isn't it? Because you'd much rather your team probably go down fighting than trying to shut up shop and either going for a 0-0 or taking it to extra time and a penalty shootout. The fact that they were able to get over the line with all of that injury time, I just think added to the spectacle and added to the drama and the jeopardy of the game, and arguably made it a much more interesting product for the FA Cup to deliver.
And I think we spoke earlier in the year about, the economic trade-off between winning something and qualifying for Europe, and I think we came to the conclusion that there wasn't really much in it, but you would probably get more for even qualifying for the Europa Conference League ultimately than you would do for winning the FA Cup. But I think in terms of the longevity of Palace's commercial plans, is it? Could you put a price on how much a win like Saturday will ultimately be worth?
Well, it's transformative on the basis they're now in European competition. So their budget line has just added upwards of 50-60 million euros to it, which is, in the context of a Palace budget, probably a 20% uplift in what they're able to generate on an annual basis. Ben Stevens, the assistant sporting director, did one of my VSI courses, so trained with us as a sporting director. A great guy. He's been at the club for a long time, kind of risen up through the ranks, and he'll be looking at that thinking, right, that gives us a level of flexibility now to potentially invest in the summer. You mentioned a moment or so ago about the opportunity for them to really retain their leading talent. Of course, Mark Gay was the subject of some pretty intense transfer scrutiny, wasn't he, last summer, and I think again in January. Eberechi Eze, the same. Adam Wharton, there'll be lots of suitors looking at him, and I think the promise now of European competition for a season, the opportunity for them really to kick on with a level of squad investment that they might not have been able to deliver without this FA Cup win, I think is really exciting for the football club, for all of those associated with it. And ultimately, if they're able to keep those leading players, or at least some of them, reinvest sensibly, they could really kick on and have some good success next year.
I think Palace, were widely acknowledged to be excellent, in the community, and I think you saw that on Saturday. But I think undeniably, with Eze, Gay, Wharton, people forget that Gay and Eze had to really battle to get first team football, had to battle to get to where they are now. Wharton was at Blackburn, wasn't he? Bought in for not a huge amount of money. So I can't see that Palace, Palace's model will always be to a certain extent governed, with bringing in these unpolished diamonds and creating these amazing footballers that we're seeing now, and then selling them on. I think that's not going to change. But what might change is the fact, I think that a lot of players, given the choice between Palace and another club, will look at what they've done with Gay, with Eze, with Wharton and others, and say, I think that's definitely the right club for me. And I might not, spend more than 3 or 4 years there, but from what I've seen, it looks like I'm definitely going to improve as a footballer. Yeah,
look, they've had to deliver that player trading model, haven't they? Find those diamonds in the rough, those young players to come through into their academy. I was reading about Eze. He was turned down by countless clubs and just carried on fighting, carried on trying, and obviously his talent was able to shine through ultimately. But there will be a challenge for them to keep hold of those assets, because they are now worth tens of millions of pounds. Mark Gay's probably in that 60, 70, 80 million bracket. Adam Wharton is probably approaching the similar sort of level, but given his kind of price ceiling and his age, and Eze is probably not too far away from that as well. So they've got some big assets on their hands now. Big questions for them will be, do we capitalise on these players, or do we look to, perhaps move one of them out, bring a huge amount of money into the football club, and then redo that whole player trading model again, so that they can have some longer term financial sustainability, but also that kind of on-field success, which I think is important as well.
Yeah, and in broader terms, I mean, just looking at the FA Cup, I feel after Saturday that this is a game that's really breathed fresh life into that competition. As I'd imagine the FA are absolutely, delighted with the way that this year's competition has gone. We had Forest and Villa in the semi-finals. Two clubs who haven't been in that position for quite a while. Crowds have been huge, especially in the latter rounds. I think we saw at Forest, how much it meant to those fans to get as far as they did. Wolves and Bournemouth. It's been a really, really good competition, and commercially for the FA, that's a great signpost, isn't it?
Yeah, it's probably a double-edged sword to a certain extent. The FA and the FA Cup as a competition want the most exposure they can possibly get, and you typically would increase your level of exposure with the kind of leading teams being in those latter stages of the competition. What we've got though now in the Premier League is a more balanced playing field. It's not completely balanced, but more teams are competing up in those top 8 places, and you can start to see the impact of the television broadcast deal starting to really take hold at some of those so-called smaller clubs, so they can compete a little bit more in the transfer market. They're bringing in young players, less experienced coaches that are able to really demonstrate a tangible impact on the playing squad. And then when you go into the domestic cup competitions, given that other clubs are also playing in and around European competitions, it gives that opportunity to be a little bit more diversified in the clubs that are being, or at least are challenging up in those, quarterfinals, semi-finals, or even the finals. And that in itself brings new eyeballs to screens, which I think the broadcasters will be fairly pleased with. Ultimately, it will come down to how marketable the clubs are. I think the Palace story is really quite compelling. I think the community impact they have is hugely compelling, and I think the development work they can do on the back of that community engagement could tell quite a nice story about Crystal Palace over the next 12 months. Newcastle perhaps in a different position now because they've got the Sovereign Wealth Fund that's in there. The Aston Villa story I actually don't think is as compelling as Crystal Palace's, so I think it's a double-edged sword. That whilst the broadcasters often want those big clubs to be competing in finals, you have this underdog story that you can now sell.
Yeah. And I just find, when it comes to winning trophies, if anyone doubted how much winning a trophy meant, you only need to see the interviews with Harry Kane as well after he won the Bundesliga. I think you'd have to have either a heart of stone or be a massive Arsenal fan to not be happy for Harry after all these years. He did look like a kid in a sweet shop, didn't he? After he'd won that.
Yeah. There is nothing better than winning silverware, and I don't care what anybody says, and the club executives might be happy with the amount of money that some of these clubs are able to generate. The bottom line is any sports person is participating to be competitive and to win trophies. Goodness me, my daughter was playing in a netball championship finals on Friday, and it was in the middle group, so they were essentially playing for between 5th and 8th in this particular competition. But the way they structured it was a pyramid setup. So even though they were playing ultimately for 5th place, they would get a trophy and would get a medal. They were gutted when they fell short and came second. But the experience was amazing. The elation after the semi-final to get through to the final was awe-inspiring. And it will be exactly the same for any of these elite athletes, Harry Kane, any of the Crystal Palace players, any of the Manchester United and Spurs players in the Europa League final. Ultimately, all is forgotten about the season. No one remembers your finishing position. People remember if you've won a trophy, and Harry Kane can now say he's won a Bundesliga title, which is not something that too many people can say.
I can't say that. I'm looking forward to our podcast winning its first trophy, Rob.
Fingers crossed.
Might be a while, but it'd be worth the wait.
We need some nominations, Rich. That's what we need.
Thanks, Rob.
Cheers, mate.